Before that, I would like to ask everyone who's not a speaker to keep the microphones off so we don't have any type of interference. And we get started. Good morning from snowy and frozen Brussels, actually -8 today. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's event, How to Move Forward After a Year That Set the Women's Voice in Public and Political Affairs backwards, and the official launch of the Seeherd database. My name is Alex Martin. I am the head of GLOBSEC Brussels office, and I am very, very pleased to be hosting today's event. The Seeherd initiative is actually a long-term project implemented by GLOBSEC with the financial support of the Open Society Foundations, and it aims to empower female experts from the broader CEE region to engage into policy impact debates, create a vivid network of female experts, but also male allies, in order to bring a bit more diversity in discussions about foreign policy, defense, technology, economic issues, and so on. Today's conversation is on how female participation has changed in the past year, also in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also in light of the new or more traditional narratives that we have seen across Europe when it comes to women's rights and traditional family. The EU has a gender equality strategy 2025. However, we are a bit far from where we should be, and I'm looking forward to ask the speakers what do they think about it. With that being said, I'm really pleased to welcome Annemie Turtelboom, member of the European Court of Auditors and former Belgian Minister of Justice, Interior and Migration. Carolina Vigura, sociologist and historian, assistant professor at the Warsaw University and member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And Scarlett Varga, head of development at Bruegel, co-founder of the Brussels Binder and also GLOBSEC Tatra Summit Young Leader. Before we kickstart the conversation, I would like to remind again everyone to keep your cameras on if you feel comfortable, but your microphones off. If you want to ask questions, either send via the chat or raise your hand, and I'm gonna invite you to address the questions directly to the speaker that you're targeting, but please keep them short and sweet. As I mentioned, we are broadcasting live on all social media. And before we start the conversation, I would like to actually share my screen and actually present you the Seeherd database, which I hope many of you will be joining, or if you're not eligible and you're not part of a CEE broad region country, you will share with other female experts that you think will be a good fit for it. And this is the database, the website, seeherd.org. Here you have, it's mostly a database with female experts. We already have a couple of members. The most important functions are register as an expert or look for the members. On the right front page, you can use the search tab and use either the area of expertise, the country of origin, the languages, or even the name of a person. If you know already exactly how does it work, you will find a lot of information about other legs of the Seeherd database, the search function, the network, and so on and so forth. The members are here. You could see some of them. We already have 17 colleagues who have joined, and you could check their profile, how it works. I'm just gonna pick randomly. This is Kinga Brudzinska. She works for GLOBSEC. You will find here the name, the country of origin, country of residence, the languages that they speak, a short bio, and then the organization, sector, and a LinkedIn. There are also other possibilities to check for if the person adds their media, like myself, for example. I also added a couple of links, publications that you could see in case the person that's looking for a female expert is interested in. In order to contact the female expert, it's just going directly to their email. You leave the message. Can we have everyone on silent, please? On mute. And that's it. And the very important part is registering as an expert. How does it work? Creating your profile, name, surname. It's a very easy form, birthday. You can change the settings. Whom do you want, only yourself or someone else to see it? Country of citizenship, country of residence, and all the other information. What is very important is that this form, once submitted, is getting to us, the admins. You will receive an activation link initially. You need to press that activation link so the profile is available to us. Then one of my colleagues is checking the profile to see that there is not a troll, that the information that was submitted is actually correct, is accurate. And only after the profile is verified, it is then accepted and it becomes public for the specific female expert to go back into the account. So more or less, this is how the database works. If you have any questions, either at info@seeherd.org or contact us directly, you have our contacts. But I really hope that you will be using it and you will be sharing it widely, so we make sure that we don't have any longer manuals and we don't have women being silenced or being absent from the most critical conversations on issues like foreign policy, defense, economics, technology, and so on and so forth. With that being said, it's time to kick off our conversation. So I would like to invite Annemie to give us a bit of a European perspective on what has happened at the EU level. How did COVID influence the gender equality policies, female participation in public life, and what we should be aware of moving forward?
Oh, thank you very much, Alexandra. And first of all, I would like to thank to GLOBSEC for the initiative in addressing a very timely topic. It is a great pleasure to speak to you about this important question, because many of you may wonder now to what extent COVID-19 has set women backwards. And one thing is for sure, whether it is publications from the United Nations, the World Bank, the European Commission, or the European Parliament, there is quite a lot of material suggesting that the pandemic jeopardizes decades of gains made in gender equality. I just want to highlight 4 elements we need to think of in this context. And of course, I'm very well aware that this does not give a full picture. My first point will be the work-life balance of professionals. And maybe you have heard of the British social media advert urging people to stay home, save lives, which the British government had to withdraw after it was heavily criticized for stereotyping women. The ad showed various women homeschooling children and doing domestic chores, while the only man featured in the ad was depicted relaxing on a sofa. This type of ad reminds us to the ad of the 60s, where women's main role and quality lay in their housewifely and motherly duties. Now, since the outbreak of COVID-19, many women must have felt catapulted back of the ads of the past. The only difference being is now women also have jobs outside of the house or via teleworking. And the answer to this question, we just can go back to the pre-COVID times, because according to ACDate, in almost half of the EU countries, women spend at least twice as much time caring for their children as men do before the pandemic. And what we know is that since the outbreak of the pandemic, mothers spend up to 60% more time with their children than men. There are a lot of articles on it in the Financial Times, but also data from the UK, from the US, from Germany. They has demonstrated that working from home, mothers are doing approximately 1.5 hours extra on childcare a day compared to working from home fathers. And similar findings have been documented in Spain and Italy. So, of course, if you add these developments to the pre-corona figures, it is obvious that women's work-life balance has been worsened significantly since the pandemic. A second point will be about the job losses, because of course for women who are working, the work balance it can be tough, but there are other women with even more who are even more facing more existential problems. And that is what Mrs. Mason refers to as the she session, when she said while during the financial crisis, the idea of man session was widespread. Now we are looking at an economic crisis whose impact is more detrimental for women. There are several reasons for it. First, the sectors have been most hit by lockdown measures, are highly feminized sectors. Secondly, around the world, women dominate in informal employment. And thirdly, you have the single mothers who are particularly affected by job losses, with only 16% of single parents continuing in employment during lockdown. A next point, of third point, is domestic violence, and I try to be very quick that I stay within my 5 minutes. The domestic violence is, to me, a very important topic I would like to address to you, because as a former Minister of Home Affairs, I'm quite familiar, unfortunately, with this topic of domestic, and it is an issue that is often called to mind when talking about women and COVID-19. The confinement, the lack of mobility, the increased stress levels have made women extremely vulnerable and increasingly exposed to domestic violence. Although it's hard to measure because there is always a black box, the following figures are highly alarming. Since the beginning of the pandemic, calls to domestic violence hotlines have increased across the EU, and the WHO Europe suggests this rate might be up to 60%. But of course, I know that a lot of governments have made efforts to try to reduce the risk to women, but the situation remains severe and potentially life-threatening. And to finish on a more positive note, we can also talk about the role of female leaders during the pandemic. And then there was the Harvard Business Review study. Women were rated more positively on 13 of 19 competences comprising overall leadership effectiveness during the pandemic. So I think, to conclude, I would like to say, like, never let a good crisis to waste. So, and I think that in the aftermath of the crisis, it will be extremely important for policymakers not only to think about methods to recover the economy, but surely have in mind that there is an inequality that became larger during and due to this pandemic. So this is very briefly my introduction. Alexandra, I'm of course open for a lot of questions, and I have a lot more data so I can share them with everyone in the chat, but I will leave it for now.
Thanks a lot, Annemie. I think that the figures are actually very much worrying, and I just hope that more decision makers and policymakers and politicians are actually aware of them across the board, not just at the EU, but actually country specific or region specific. And Carolina, I want to get to you, and you have heard also some of the comments and the figures presented by Annemie. I'm just wondering, how is CEE different? Do we see similarities? I cannot help myself but mention the women's marches against the government's decision in Poland. So we see a bit of momentum there as well. But are we also in a historical cycle? Are we repeating the same loop, or this is just a very outlier moment in the historical context?
Yes, thank you so much for these questions, and also thank you for having me. I'm really delighted to be here and to be a part of the launching of this project. Now, of course, Annemie has mentioned, and you have mentioned, many important aspects of how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the position of women, work and life balance of women, and also women's rights. And I would just like to focus exactly on this one particular point, which is actually women's rights, and also the the interconnection between the pandemic, the populist politics, and women's rights. Namely, when we discuss the pandemics and women and their position in the public sphere, and also the economy and also their rights, it is very important that we ask the question why the women's issues are so eagerly used by the populist politicians. What is actually the reason for this? Because this the answers for this explain a lot of the dynamics of what is actually happening right now. So of course there are more than one answers, but at least one of the answers is this. The COVID-19 pandemics has been dealt quite well by liberal democracies, but in those regimes that are like my country, but also in other Central and Eastern European countries that have departed from liberal democracy towards illiberalism, in those regimes, the COVID-19 pandemic hasn't been dealt very well. So the populist politicians often seek for a way to cover their incapability to deal with COVID pandemics, and they look for issues that might spark a lot of collective emotions, also start protests, and drive our attention from the pandemics and, for example, for the problems in the healthcare system. So when you mention the protests in defense of women's rights in Poland after the Constitutional Tribunal's decision in October 2020, and now after the decision has been published just 1 or 2 weeks ago, Alexandra, then it is very important that we stress that this has all happened in the midst of the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemics, and it has all happened in the moment when it has been increasingly obvious that the healthcare system doesn't sufficiently play its role in my country. So it's very important to have this in mind, that we are dealing here with a kind of a perverted entertainment coming from the illiberal populists who are giving something to our attention. And of course, they are lighting a lot of fire with their policies, so that we don't remember about what is actually happening in our daily life. Now, this is one reason. The other reason might be that, of course, it is also not by chance that women's rights are appearing in this context, namely that the illiberal politicians have this dream, this idea of freezing the change in society, freezing the modernization as something which is causing too much fear and too much frustration for many citizens. So they are trying to convince their voters that there is a kind of an imagined community from the past. Of course, in the past, women's rights and women's positions is different. So this is a part of their wider agenda, and at the same time, it is a part of their media strategy. And it is very important to remember that. It is also, I think, worth remembering that it is not going to stop. I mean, they are not going to back off, because the logic is, I'm trained as a historian of ideas. So I think about, for example, the French philosopher Montesquieu, when I'm saying that Montesquieu basically argued that if a government is despotic, the despot, the person who is in charge, is actually a slave of the whole system. So he or she has to push the despotism always further and further. So we are not going to expect an alleviation of the new measures, new ideas, new politics. Just the opposite. I think we are going to expect, we should expect new similar steps. Now, for example, of course, the question is what to do with it. And I will just very briefly say, perhaps three strategies might be of use here. First, which is, I think, very visible in my country. It also can be visible in other Central and Eastern European countries. Working in the center, so building the center and not radicalizing, because once an opposition movement, including those protesters in defense of women's rights, once they are radicalizing, they're very easy to be ridiculed, and they also lose the wide support. And here, wide support of more conservative voters and also of men is extremely important. Now, the second strategy might be simply that we should remember it is not actually a question of women's rights. It is a question of human rights. And this is, I think, crucial, because once you translate the whole discussion to human rights and not to women's rights, you open the whole spectrum of possible allies. And this is, I think, extremely important. Also, the rule of law and the defense of the rule of law as something that is serving the whole society and not only half of it, not only women, is extremely important here. And the third, very simple, populists may be for many of us, they present a type of entertainment in politics, which doesn't, which is not evaluated positively by us, and there are surely good reasons for that. But I do believe that we also defending women's rights should be also entertaining. So one has to look for passionate and convincing strategies of appearing in the media, social media included.
Thank you, Carolina. And what I just hope is that not just on one side having the political representatives from the populist side not going to back off, but also women groups and community organizing and those leaders fighting for human rights and for women's rights not backing off. So I hope that will be an equal equation. Scarlett, you have been in the think tank community for quite some time, and you have also been at the forefront of advancing female expertise in the public debates through the Brussels binder, but also beyond. So what's the situation post 2020? Did you see any type of changes when it comes to also access of female experts to conferences, research positions, accessing top-level positions, both within institutions, but also within the expert community? A recent political studies also shows that at least within the EU, institution is still a men's world, despite quite some efforts done from the top level, from Commission President von der Leyen down the line. How did 2020 influence? We heard both the economic side from Annemie and the political side from Carolina. What's happening in the middle?
Thank you, Alexandra. Before I reply to you, let me just say thank you for having me on this very distinguished panel. It's really interesting to hear from all of you. And also just a very warm congratulations on what you have achieved with the database. As you know, I know very well what it means, all the efforts it takes through the Brussels binder database that we put together. It's really a big milestone to have such a database, especially in our region, in the Central Eastern European region, and it's really necessary because as you very well know, the EU Gender Equality Index has shown that our countries, many of our countries, and I'm saying our just to be more inclusive in that, unfortunately, is really faring at the bottom of the list when it comes to gender equality and especially in leadership positions. So just to, yes, indeed, to reply to your question, I think Annemie has touched upon a lot of things that I wanted to mention, and I would like to just maybe complement on some points and add some view from the think tank sector, if I may, especially an economic think tank sector. So first and foremost, what I would definitely agree with is that the coronavirus is skewed, or has skewed, or it's skewing actually, playing field that wasn't ever leveled on the first place. This means that women are more vulnerable to economic shocks as this one, exactly because we have already experienced inequalities. One important area in seeing where we see that in practice is the nature of work, of course. The nature of work remains significantly gender specific. Women and men tend to cluster in different occupations. And this is happening both in mature and emerging economies. So there are some level differences, but unfortunately, we see it as much in Africa as we see it in European countries. And as Anemi was saying, there is quite a lot of data out there that has been floating, you know, whether it's really referring to the few months when we experienced the first wave or just a more general view on what the pandemic or what such a shock means for us women, for this big part of the population. A recent study by McKinsey, for example, finds that female jobs are 19% more at risk globally than male jobs, which is really a big difference. And actually Smart Asset, this is an agency, Smart Asset took a closer look at this, at the gender unemployment gap. And what they did basically is they compared previous recessions with the shock of now, with the pandemic that we are living today. And maybe many of you know or anticipate the findings, but what they found actually is that the peak unemployment rates were higher for men than women during past recessions. And obviously this is explained by the fact that male-dominated sectors were more affected at that point, while thus far, I mean, where we are at the moment, the coronavirus pandemic, in the coronavirus pandemic, women have been more exposed to layoffs than men. Actually, I have some data here. Female unemployment was 16.2% compared to male unemployment to 13%. And this is just for the US. And, you know, this is really telling because as Anemi was also saying, women really account or take up most of these jobs. 66% of customer service clerks, for example, are women. So these sectors, the effect on these sectors is really visible. Then the second important point indeed here is the division between paid and unpaid work and the division of unpaid work, which remains unbalanced. 75% of the world's total unpaid care work is on women. And of course, this is based on several factors. It can be based on economic factors. You know, when families are to decide who will be picking up more of this unpaid work, whether it's the man or the woman, often it is an executive decision in the family for the man to be it because of the gender pay gap. So the family is just better off with the man working, you know, more hours maybe, or, you know, taking up more the formalized work because the income is more steady. Then there are also social and cultural reasons that we referred to before. And I think that in our region specifically, we see how much, you know, tradition and religion can influence these gender roles and how they were now affected. Then another point, maybe again to complement what has been said, is also class issues. And I spoke to about this before with Susanna, Alexandra, if you remember, we had a chat in the summer. And it's really interesting because the pandemic has had a worse effect on blue-collar workers compared to white-collar workers. And this is very much affecting also how different women are affected. So I think once we get down to the data itself, we really need to look into, we really need to look for gender disaggregated data, because we, you know, often just speak about gender biases as such in generalizations, but diversity means much more. And we need to understand what are also the discrepancies between different categories and different classes of women, whether it's, you know, whether we refer to Black women, minorities, or single women for that matter, who maybe take care alone of a child. So maybe that's just to complement on the policy support. I think that we will be discussing more, and I think Anemi is actually can tell us more, of course, on how these roles have evolved or changed in decision-making roles inside our institutions. You mentioned the EU gender equality strategy, and Alexandra, I agree with you. We are not on track with that. However, now I think it's clearer than ever that this is a short-term strategy. It's until 2025. We would have said that this is, you know, like a long term, and we have enough time to build it up. This is now short term. We are in a transition period. So we are really not at the end of, not out of the woods when it comes to the pandemic. And I think what is very important from policymaking point of view is that gender equality is really at the center of, or is really mainstreamed in our recovery plans. There are discussions on that, of course, but they need to be mainstreamed in the budgets even. So starting from maybe, supporting those worst affected sectors that we were just speaking about, where women are predominantly taking up the slack. So maybe I stop here, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
I will continue with your last point on how do we make the gender equality policy mainstream in the recovery and the resilience planning moving forward. And Annemie, you are in your position, you're also looking at what the EU is doing as such, and what individual member states, individual countries. So how is that discussion going, at least at the institutional level, and what are different countries' perspectives if we see that? We have the big green and digital transition, which seems to be the most promising part of the recovery. Yet in the same time, when we look at who's dealing with the transition and the crisis management post-pandemic, we don't see so many female voices. So I'm just afraid if there is a mismatch between the actual implementation and the policy desired outcome. Or maybe I'm totally wrong.
No, I don't think you are wrong. Now, as European Court of Auditors, we are all the time auditing after the policies were put into place. And currently, and I'm really very much looking forward, we are conducting an audit. It's the first time on the gender budgeting, and I'm really wondering how much of the money will go, because I fully agree with what Scarlett and also Carolina said. We started this pandemic already with unequal weapons. There was still a gap. The gap was in some countries larger than in other countries. I can give you some data about how many people are doing. So if you compare Greece to Austria, to Czechia, to Sweden, you see a large difference on how much more work people are doing in households. And I agree with, I don't know, was it Scarlett who said that we are not completely on track. I also see it in my institution. We have a lot of goals to obtain on gender equality. We are moving in the right direction, but it is still very much an ongoing business, and you need to be aware of the fact that you can easily have a setback. And I saw it now, you see it during this pandemic, that women also in the European institutions, and okay, we are not the worst because we have a salary, we have work, so we are actually the most, how shall I say, in the best position that you can have at this time. But even then you see that the gaps are coming on the market, because women who need to deal with three young children at home, of course, it is impacting their work. And if it impacts their work, it will also at a certain moment impact their career. So I think it's not to me to say what policymakers need to do. So that's the reason why I was very happy with the statement of Carolina and how populist movements are using and abusing this pandemic to blame even more, or to try to find another scapegoat. But in my opinion, it is, and that's the reason why I'm so happy with your database, because we need to have data at this moment, and the data needs to be so detailed as possible, because we can only urge policymakers to adapt their future policy, when they know the data where they can rely on. And it will be extremely important also for the European level to give, in as fast as possible way, detailed data for the different policymakers, because there's a lot of money will be put in the economy, 1,800 billion euros. It's a lot of money. But if you don't take into account that you need to adapt your policies and thinking about, and I like what you said, it's not women's rights, it's human rights, because you're right, it's not only women's rights, it are human rights, but you will need to put a gender component in the policymaker that will be put into place European Commission. And therefore, I'm happy that we started with that gender budgeting audit, because it's in a very timely manner that we can say whether because it, and actually there is a very good database, I think it's from the United Nations, I can pull it up and put it in the chat, where you can see for each country, where you can see what were the measures taken during the pandemic, and how is the gender component taken into account.
Thank you, Annemie. I still had a lot of questions on my own, but there are a lot of questions in the Zoom chat, so I would like to get to them. And Andre, I don't know if you want to go, Andre Matišak, if you want to go on screen, or should I read the question? Is about the 30 years of Visegrad cooperation and the upcoming Before Summit. Mentioned about Poland. I assume, Karolina, this is for you. Only one head of state is woman, president of Slovakia, Zuzana Čaputová. And what would you like to hear from the president of Slovakia? Should she publicly address the situation in Poland, or should she not interfere in the domestic affairs? Karolina.
Listen, thank you so much, Andre, for this question. I have been reflecting on that for a couple of minutes now. Now, you know, it's always important if a strong political leader addresses a given situation. And I do believe Zuzana Čaputová, with her image of a politician who is still a new person in politics, still, in comparison to many of her colleagues, and at the same time with her ambience of empathy and caring, which she actually stressed a lot during her campaign. I think a statement from her might be important. But, you know, we shouldn't forget the fact that if the civil societies of Central and Eastern Europe are going to deal with populism and defend women's rights, it is not because Zuzana Čaputová or anyone else from outside in the situation of Poland, for example, or in the situation of Hungary, says something meaningful. I do believe that this is a challenge for exactly those civil societies, because dealing with illiberal populism is actually a challenge to each and given civil society. And I do believe that this ray of optimism, the presidential elections in the US, however complicated the future of Trumpism will be, still, this is the result of what has been happening in the US and not of any reaction of any politician around the world. Now, the question is, of course, what is actually the crucial thing to be done in those civil societies in Central and Eastern Europe? And I do believe that the most crucial challenge to be met is actually creating new ideas. Because only the ideas for the future might give us the sort of direction that those civil societies can aspire to. Let me just come back to 1989, because this is a crucial year for this region. In 1989, the sources of hope were in the West, were in Western Europe and also in the US. And in a way, those societies in Central and Eastern Europe have emigrated mentally in 1989. We all tried to be Western Europeans or Westerners, if I can say so. Now, even if we stayed in the same place, but you know, a generation has passed. Central and Eastern Europe is paradoxically now more Western than it has been perhaps ever in its past. And and many voters are critical towards the West. Populists are abusing this criticism. Perhaps more liberal and democratic political forces would just understand that there is a need for a criticism towards one's home, because West is now home to Central and Eastern Europe. But basically, what is needed is giving a start to new liberal and democratic ideas, and I do believe this is actually a challenge for supporters of Central and Eastern Europe, supporters of its civil society. Now, of course, diagnosing the problem is one thing. It's extremely important, but we mustn't forget that perhaps the most important questions we have to ask right now is how to get out of the situation we got into. I do believe that the legal aspect of this, how do we go out of the situation where, for example, in my country, the Constitutional Tribunal by many lawyers is actually considered not to be a legal one. So this says a lot about the decision concerning abortion, because some constitutional lawyers will tell you, well, actually, the judges that are in the tribunal should not be there. They have not been legally chosen and legally elected to their posts. So perhaps this decision did not have place, actually. So this is the crucial problem, I believe. Finding the legal solution out of the situation, a legal one which is accepted by the populations, and at the same time which does not repeat the same steps that have been taken after 2015.
I think that the legal part, which is very complicated, and I'm nowhere close to having a legal background, is just compounding the social, cultural, economic issues that currently exist. And my main fear is whether or not we will get to a level of acceptance by the population that could lead to change in the midst of we are fragmented as societies. We are highly polarized. We don't seem to find that middle ground that you also mentioned, on not being seen radicalized or not being seen as taking some ideas too far from what the other side is able to accept and to digest. Sierra, the time is too short for going into all this conversation. Sierra, you have a question. Please also mention to whom you're addressing to.
Sure. Hello. I worked this summer on the report with GLOBSEC, and I've returned to my master's now, but I've really appreciated this morning getting to witness our own panel of female experts. I think the question may be most fit for enemy, but I wouldn't mind to hear from anyone's opinion. I think the European Union definitely deserves a recognition for how momentous the fiscal recovery plans are in providing the economic resources for demographics which are suffering. But I wondered particularly, I really appreciated the distinction that enemy made that females are a specific demographic which require their own policy responses and own protections. And I was curious if any of you have recommendations or ideas of what exactly this gender equality policy that we are speaking of would entail in practical application for women.
Thank you, Sierra. And I do want to bring also Doris, because she has a question on actually female leadership in CEE, which is very interesting.
Hello, thank you so much. Thank you for this discussion. I think it's a very interesting conversation to have. And my question is more for Scarlett, I think. Well, living over the past couple of months in Romania, where we had a couple of elections, local but also national, I couldn't help but being outraged to notice that at the end of all this, we have extremely few female representatives in local but also national politics, like only one woman who is a minister. So I was wondering if the absence of these women in national leadership positions in the government, as in the head of state level, is one of the big obstacles of achieving change, achieving gender equality and human rights as a whole? Or do we need more of a long-term change, like one woman would not have a major change, but we need a more of a strategic approach and a long-term vision? Thank you.
Thank you, Doris. Annemie?
Thank you very much. It is not so easy to make to give immediately like a recommendation, a practical recommendation, as I think that the recommendations will be quite different from member states to member states, as there is, you cannot compare Sweden at this moment with, for example, Czechia. If you compare just the data on how much people, women do in their households, there is a large difference. But what I think that it's a good idea, that is with the recovery and resilience plans, there will be now national recovery and resilience facility plans as it is necessary for the European Commission. And I know it's not only about digital and green, but I also know that there is also the gender aspect will be an element of it. So it's not only the purpose that the post-COVID-19 Europe, that it is a greener Europe, a more digital Europe, a more resilient Europe, and that it's better, it will better fit for the current or for the future and for the upcoming challenges. So it will be very, very important, I think, for the European Commission just to check in the national plans that there is enough that gender aspect, because in one country it can be focused on the violence, the domestic violence. In another country it can be much more important for the glass ceiling or for people young or for women to make careers. In other countries it's perfectly possible that they need to highlight the fact that a lot of women are still working in like unofficial jobs that are not registered, and that they are more vulnerable. And if you dive into the data, and there are like IKE, they have a lot of data on it, there you see the differences. And I think it will be important for, but European Commission does have a tool, because with these national plans, they can take a look at the gender aspect. And it would be good maybe at a certain moment to have such a gender tracking, not only for the world made by UNDP, but also from the European level. And that's also the reason I put it in the chat, Alexandra, but I want to say it, why your database is so great, because even in the country that I know the best, in Belgium, there was at a certain moment, there were only male experts on TV, because a lot of journalists said, but actually we don't have the names of the female experts because they are not visible. So you make them you make them visible. And of course, at the Court of Auditors, we are all the time looking at data, because you need to start from data to be able to define KPIs and to see whether people are fulfilling their objectives. So for me, it's actually data, but secondly, the National Recovery and Resilience Facility plans will be the ideal plan for members of parliament in the different member states, but also for the European Commission to check whether their money has also a gender aspect. And I think that will be very important, because it will be quite hard to make like one measure. You see the lines, it's single moms, it's the unpaid work, it's the work-life balance, it's the domestic violence, and so on and so on. You see the lines that to take, but to go to the part of the solution, you need to be quite tailored. You need to have tailor-made solutions.
Annemie, can I follow up on that? Because I totally agree that the national plans are at the core of how the big strategy will look like, and it needs to be differentiated. But what happens when the national strategies are drafted by male experts only, when there is no female perspective to actually be brought in the conversation? Because I think that that's something that across CE, and Carolina and Scarlett, please agree or disagree with me, I'm just afraid that the real understanding won't be there, or the reality check on what's the situation on the ground. So again, the intention might be very good, but do we have actually ways to ensure that the national plans are really reflective of the situation in specific countries?
Well, that's a very, very good point, of course, but that's the reason before you can have access to that European money, your plans need to be adopted by the European Commission.
Mhm.
So there is, even if there are in certain countries, and I'm not going to name them, where you know that the female aspect is not the main priority for some leaders, to be very polite. Well, then you have, of course, the European Commission, and I think the European Commission is quite diverse. We have a female president, so there are a lot of, how shall I say, there are a lot of possibilities just to put pressure on that female aspect, because you're totally right. Also, there are plenty, even in the countries where the gender discussion is ahead of other countries. Even there you can have aspects. Just think about the book The Invisible Women. There are not only data of the gender gap from like obvious countries, but there are also data from Scandinavian countries where there were invisible women who were not visible in the databases. But I think there is a tool from the European Commission. They can take a look at it. They will take the angle of green, they will take the angle of digitalization, but they can also perfectly take the angle of gender equality.
We'll make sure that some of these points from the conversation will get to the Commission when we start promoting the database and the report. Scarlett, CEE leaders. I think that we, for example, in Romania, we only have the president of the Senate and one minister. We are scoring very badly when it comes to gender equality. So how do we change that mentality in terms of exceeding in top level positions, also at the political level in CEE?
Yeah, thank you, Alexandra, and thanks for the question. I will try to address this question, and if I may, I would just have two more points as a follow-up to Annemie's points, and also one to Carolina's, if you allow me. I know that we are short on time. So I start with the third one then. Romania's governance and I think governance in many other countries. I think there are obviously structural problems that need to be resolved, whether you say first or in parallel. It's up for discussion, but I think that there is an obvious corruption issue still that needs to be addressed, resolved before we even start, talking about gender biases. I mean, I grew up in Romania. It's funny because when you ask me honestly, what do you remember? Do you remember, being discriminated against? Do you remember being pushed away? Do you remember? If I honestly reply to you, I don't remember. I went to university even in Cluj-Napoca, and I felt like, it was just cool that in a way I went to a class where it was more a STEM orientation and, but that was it. So I didn't feel this very concretely. When I started feeling it is when I moved here. When I really started reading about it and I started understanding where the biases are and how those biases are implemented, and understanding that I am not doing anything about them. Like I am not protecting my own self against them because it's too uncomfortable for me to bring it up and too uncomfortable for me to make the point that, yes, there is a bias. Yes, there is an inequality. And yes, it affects me and it will affect my children and it affected my parents. So I think okay, I'll stop here. And then just one more point on the governance side. I think for change, we don't just need to look for best examples. I think Romania, compared to, for example, Hungary or Poland, I think Romania is still very much West-oriented. So they really want to learn still from the West. They are, even the youth, it's open. So I think that there is definitely a hook there that can be used, but I think education is really key. Reforming the education system. And I know this will not happen tomorrow, but this will be the first and foremost. And I think that there are also organic changes already. So we were those countries, that after 89, we were just pushed through the limits, like we didn't have time to digest all this change that the Western countries had time to digest. And we were just pushed in there and like, oh, here are all these rights and here are all these options you have. So do something with them. And we just don't know, I think as countries, we just don't know exactly yet how to all integrate them. But I think that, education and collaborations with Western countries will help. And then just maybe two more very quick points. Just to reply to Katerina on the and the role of civil society. I entirely agree. I think that we need very different tools in how we address these issues, because again, going back to my example here, you need totally different tools and dialogue when you address biases than when you address non-acceptance. So I would say almost it's easier to address non-acceptance. It's easier to try to bring arguments in front of somebody who just doesn't think about this or who just doesn't agree with it, because there are clear arguments now. We have studies, we have good examples, we have economy, like companies showing us that profits are going up. There are so many best practices that we can show. But the problem here, I think, that is still persisting in Western Europe is this unconscious bias, where whoever you speak to, they look in your eyes and they say, but when they need to take the action and really implement organizational changes or policy changes, very, very uncomfortable about many things. So I think there we have a lot of work to do. And I think that databases such as ours are really trying to address that issue, because, also this was a bias. It was, I'm trying to involve women, but they're not available. They're just not present. Well, no problem. We will show you that they are. So you cannot explain this anymore. And then really just the last point, indeed, on policymaking, I think data is key. That's the first thing for KPIs and so on. But I think data has to also go, unfortunately, I have to say, because I'm a think tanker and it's unfortunate, but it has to go hand in hand with public opinion. Because politicians, maybe not as much on the European level, but on the national level, will be driven by public opinion. So they will form their discourses based on public opinion. So, and very concretely about policies, I mean, I mentioned before, but what we learned from this pandemic, for example, like if you look at part-time employment, Google is now working on a study on this, on future of work and gender. So part-time employment, where women are very present, they have to be, better paid. They have to be covered by social protection. Platform workers, there are many women who went, we were pushing them to go out on the labor market and set up their own businesses, but now they are not protected anymore. So that needs to be addressed. And then maybe one more point on specific policy recommendations. We could, through the budget, we could financially recognize indeed those sectors that were most affected and where women are more present. That is doable. It's something, because, anyways, we are now thinking on the European level, which sectors to so-called save, if I may say so, and which to let transform. I don't want to let's sink, but let transform. And with the same thinking, we should also put the gender aspect in it and think which are those sectors where women are present and they were most affected. There are studies on that, and those could be more supported. And I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Scarlett. Carolina, I do want to get to you for the last minute with a question, because you made the right point on diagnosing is very, very important, and we try to do it, and we are not the only ones. But how do we get out of the situation? And I do have a question on building female talent pipeline, and that's something that we seem to not be doing it well. So even when we kept on talking about Chancellor Angela Merkel, if you look down the line, you don't see other female leaders coming up or not so many. And across Europe, the situation is more or less the same, and also beyond Europe. So how do we build female talent pipelines, both in political, but also in public affairs, and who should be in charge of it? Sorry to put you on the spotlight.
We should be in charge of it. We all should be in charge of it. Madeleine Albright once said that there is a special place in hell for women who do not help other women. So I think she's right. I think it's in the power of each and every of us that we seek for other female leaders and try to encourage them to not only to stick to their habits, because what Scarlett said, Scarlett, you're right. It's very, very difficult to engage women, and we all, I do believe, have the same experience but that is not enough to have a need and to have an urge and want to do it, because it's very difficult at times to encourage other women to be leaders. But I do think that we have such a responsibility. And also, you know, Scarlett has mentioned this problem with digesting the Western values and women's rights, etc., for our societies. And I do believe this is a crucial remark, because we've gained a lot during those 30 years of democratic and economic transformation, but at the same time, we lost a lot. We lost a lot of habits, of sources, of traditional sources of identity, of local networks that were functioning before. And now, well, basically, we believed in 1989 that we perhaps do not need them anymore. We escaped from history, but it looks as if we have to create all those habits again, anew. So let's just hope. We shouldn't, I believe, look for possible winners of the race. We should rather think about what responsibility and what scope of action we are capable of.
Thank you, Carolina. We finished with a more inspirational and optimistic perspective on the issue.
Liberals should be optimistic.
Exactly. Just a couple of notes from my side. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you to our speakers for the wonderful conversation. Again, please do not hesitate to sign up to the database or share it with those female experts in your network that would be eligible to be part of it. Already, we have an open invitation from Andrej Matiček, who will use the database to reach out to some of the female experts for his upcoming article on V4. And last but not least, we will be releasing a report on the absent voices in the Visegrad countries. We have looked at both public, private, and NGO sectors, and on the distribution of positions, cabinet positions, ministers, ambassadors, and so on and so forth. That will be released just before the International Women's Day, but it has quite some interesting data, and that type of disaggregated data that policymakers should take into account when crafting policies, both at the regional, national, and European level. So stay tuned for more. Again, thank you so much for spending the morning with us. I hope that some of the ideas will be carried within your own circles and within your own work, and looking forward to continue to engaging with you through Seeherd or the broader GLOBSEC set of activities. And have a great day, everyone.